Ready? Good evening and welcome to the Drive at 5 on IntellectualRadio.com/iHeart radio station. I'm your host, Roman. We have a great show planned for you today. Please stay tuned for Warriors Talk at 6 p.m. with my girl, Rochelle, right after the Drive at 5. Tonight, my guest is a former congressman of the 2nd District. He is the author of his latest book entitled The Finger of God. Please give a warm welcome to the Drive at 5, or welcome back to the Honorable Jesse Jackson Jr. Welcome back to the Drive, sir.
Roman, thank you for having me.
What are your thoughts on President Biden dropping out of the presidential race yesterday?
This is one of the most momentous occasions in American politics, maybe American political history, given a sitting president with the stature of Joe Biden, whose extraordinary decades of service to the United States created essentially a vacancy in the campaign, not a vacancy in the presidency, but a vacancy in the campaign. And so on the one hand, we congratulate and thank Joe Biden for his service. But on the other hand, there is this sense of somber and sorrow because his extraordinary legacy of service is ending and coming to its final term. But there's an opportunity that has presented itself for African Americans. When one considers our history from the founding of the Republic on September 17, 1787 to the present, the idea that Kamala Harris could be the first African American woman to head a major party's platform for President of the United States, the idea that she could be the 47th President of the United States, the idea that if, for whatever reason, Joe Biden relinquishes his term as president, the remaining 6 months, she may serve a short term as president for 6 months, but she could also serve 8 years and 6 months as president of the United States, providing us with an incredible opportunity to set forward an agenda like 2025. We could use that time to create our own agenda of 2035. And that's the kind of time that we're going to need to overcome the legacy of Donald John Trump and his MAGA movement.
By President Biden withdrawing from the race, what implication does it have for the nation and world leaders when a party decides they no longer want their candidate to leave?
I'm not so sure that people decided they want their candidate to leave. Joe Biden is an 81-year-old elderly man, and the conditions of his health should be of grave concern to all of us. Obviously, his mental acuity and his speed is not what it used to be, but we more than make up for that with Kamala Harris, who he chose in 2020 to serve as his running mate, who's best qualified to understand the inner workings of the federal government, who's more than qualified, having sat very close to the President of the United States, not only for domestic decisions, but also international decisions. And most importantly, she's one of us. Howard University graduate, member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha fraternity, sorority incorporated. The fact that she knows our culture, she knows our people, she's been to all 50 states in the union. She has been vetted by the NAACP, the Urban League, the National Action Network, the Rainbow Push Coalition. She has spoken at HBCUs across the country. She has an amazing appeal to Generation X, Generation Z, and voters who felt left out of the process. Just imagine this, Roman. Since the announcement of Kamala Harris to succeed Joe Biden, she has raised nearly $100 million in one day. That is unprecedented in presidential politics, and she's going to need every bit of that to defeat Donald Trump.
Some Democrats publicly asking President Joe Biden to step down has caused division within the Democratic Party, as leaders are still not in line on a candidate. Why?
Well, this is a foregone conclusion. The candidates whose names have been suggested to replace Joe Biden, Gretchen Whitmer, she has 0 delegates for the convention just 30 days from now in the city of Chicago. Gavin Newsom has 0 delegates. He did not run for president in 2024, and so he's amassed no delegates. So he will not be the nominee based on his delegate count. Governor J.B. Pritzker has 0 delegates going into the convention in the city of Chicago, and all of them have withdrawn their candidacies and endorsed Kamala Harris, who has more than 3,000 delegates, and it only requires 1,900 to win. And so what I find so fascinating is that when we voted for the Biden-Harris ticket in the primary process, where more than 14 million people voted, including a large number of African Americans, more than 37% of the delegates who will be at the Democratic Convention in Chicago will be African American. This is the largest number of delegates to attend a Democratic convention in the history of the Democratic Party. And mind you, this was the party of Thomas Jefferson, the party of slavery. Now it's the party of Barack Obama, the party of Joe Biden, and now the party of Kamala Harris. The idea that we have 37% of the delegates and an African-American woman will be heading that ticket is an extraordinary feat and accomplishment in and of itself. And so these are exciting times for us. We have a lot of work to do. Democrats who are on the sideline need to join the campaign. They need to get involved. They need to stop complaining about what they don't have. They need to start using exactly what they do have, and that is the brightest, the sharpest, the cleanest, the most sophisticated, and the clearest prosecutor to prosecute the case against Donald Trump between now and the November election. I can't wait to hear Kamala Harris debate Donald Trump. What I would like to see happen, Roman, is that the debate commission, which was dismissed early in the campaign for these 2 debates, one of which Joe Biden did not perform well in, and I guess that's an understatement, and another debate that's expected in September. I'd like for the traditional process where Republicans hold their convention in July, Democrats hold their convention in August, but we return to the rules of the Presidential Debate Commission and give Kamala Harris 3 opportunities, 3 2-hour opportunities to challenge Donald Trump. And what you will find out is an absolute clarity from Kamala Harris, and from Donald Trump, you will find an incoherence. He was incoherent in his debate with Joe Biden, but he would be even more incoherent in a very clear-eyed, purposeful presentation presented by the next president of the United States, Kamala Harris.
You have been in the House for some time now. What will the room temperature be like on the House floor as representatives and senators return to Washington today? What is the room temperature? It's divided. Some people saying it's coming around, and some people saying, I don't know yet.
You know, I'm more concerned about what the temperature is going to be on the floor of the Democratic convention when Kamala Harris rounds this corner in about 30 days. I'm no longer a member of Congress. I have some sense that members who may be struggling in certain districts, they need to stop complaining. They need to start registering people to vote. And many of them have their coattails tied to the top of the ticket. Well, the problem is many of them are not carrying their own load. When is the last time in many of these conservative districts we've actually seen a conservative Democratic member of Congress come to our churches and register people to vote? When have we seen them speak at our high schools and encourage 17-year-old students who will be 18 by November to register and vote? How many of them have spoken to seniors in high schools and in colleges, community colleges across our communities from coast to coast, encouraging students and young people to register and vote? Many of them don't do it. Many of them themselves are not even deputy registrars. What they simply do is they're lazy and they wait for someone at the top of the ticket to do all of the work, to set all of the messaging while they ride in on their coattails. The key to victory in 2024 is we stop complaining about what we don't have, and we need to go to work. And many of those Democrats who are complaining in Congress, who've gotten by without going to work, they have a challenge before them.
Since the announcement of President Biden's decision to step down and endorse Vice President Kamala Harris, some Democratic leaders, as you mentioned, such as Jeffries, Senator Schumer, former President Barack Obama, First Lady Michelle Obama, other Democratic Party leaders have yet not to endorse Vice President Harris. They express a desire of an open convention, process and believe that she still needs to be vetted. However, Vice President Harris has already been voted in in the primaries and earned her delegates according to some. The question is, does she still needs to be vetted, and does she need to earn the party's nomination despite going through the primary process with Joe Biden?
Of course, she does not need to be vetted. She's the vice president of the United States. She was vetted thoroughly by Joseph Biden when he placed her on the ticket. FBI interviews, reviews of her credentials, Secret Service interviews, and 3.5 years as vice president of the United States. A public vetting has taken place. She's run for president as vice president with Joe Biden a second time, again vetted by the voters. She doesn't have to go through that process. And this process called an open convention, the former president does not know the rules, apparently. There's no such thing as an open convention. The candidates that he might propose, that he thinks might come from an open convention, have no delegates. So there's no basis for an open convention. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden earned more than 3,000 delegates of the 3,100 delegates who will be participating in the Democratic convention in August. She only needs 1,900 to be the Democratic nominee. Those pledged delegates, those delegates who ran in Illinois, ran in Indiana, ran in South Carolina, North Carolina, ran in Washington, D.C., ran in California, who put on the ballot, I'm for Joe and Kamala, are obligated under the party rules to vote on the first ballot for Joe and Kamala. Well, Joe Biden has left the campaign, but he's turned the campaign over to Kamala Harris, and therefore she has 3,000 delegates at the convention, and they must vote for her on the first ballot. So all of this talk about an open convention, which is not in the Democratic Party's rules, which is not in our charter or our bylaws, is a process outside of the Democratic Party and process. And all of us should be ashamed by the idea that there are Democratic elites within the party that think they know better than the voters, that somehow they can create a process, an open process that leaders run, that they run, when they did not knock on a single door on the south side of Chicago, south suburbs, in Compton, in Harlem, in Markham, Illinois, in Atlanta, Georgia, in Houston, Texas, in Dallas, Texas, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They did not participate in those contests. And we must insist that the 14 million people who voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in that process, that they be respected.
Breaking news: Nancy Pelosi endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. Jeffries and Schumer will meet with the VP later on today. On social media, you were very disappointed about the Obamas, and Governor Pritzker, which is breaking news, have endorsed Kamala Harris earlier today. But the Obamas did not publicly come forward to endorse Vice President Harris, especially Obama, because of the possible historic nature of the first Black woman to ever be president. Why you were disappointed?
I'm disappointed because, one, along with the late Senator Paul Simon, I was co-chairman of Barack Obama's campaign for the United States Senate. There were only two co-chairs, me and the late Paul Simon. I was also one of the co-chairs of his campaign for President of the United States in 2008. We confronted the same pessimism in those campaigns. Do you think an African American can be elected from the Senate from the state of Illinois? And just a few short years from that point, do you think Barack Obama can become the Democratic nominee for President of the United States against Hillary Clinton? And then when we were running for president, do you think Barack Obama can be President of the United States? There's just no one who should know the process better than Barack and Michelle Obama on the rejection within the party that they themselves experienced themselves. And so when Kamala Harris, after having served 4 years as Vice President of the United States, is endorsed by the sitting President of the United States, it just seems like a no-brainer that we should just all fall behind. Now, don't get me wrong. I still respect, love, and appreciate Barack and Michelle Obama, but I think they got this one wrong. It should not be an open process. It cannot be an open process because there's no one running against Kamala Harris, and there's no surprise candidate who can show up and wow delegates at the Democratic convention and somehow change the spirit or the mood of the voters. If that were the case, Roman, when Jesse Jackson showed up in '84 and delivered a wow speech, he should have been Democratic nominee. A wow speech is not good enough. An exciting candidate is not good enough. Not in '84, not in '88, not in '92, not in '96, not in 2000, not in 2004, not in 2008, not in 2012 to the present. Every 4 years that we go through this process, you don't only vote for a personality. We love Joe. We love Barack. We love Jesse. You're not only voting for that in the event that something goes wrong. We also voted for a process, and that process cannot be usurped by an open convention or people making a call that simply does not exist in the party's rules.
Joe Manchin, breaking news, is considering rejecting his independent form and turning it back to the Democratic so he can possibly run against Kamala Harris. Have you heard that news?
Breaking news, he has decided against challenging Kamala Harris. And so I'm not worried about that at all. We welcome Joe Manchin back to the Democratic Party. As you know, many of the efforts, including the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the George Floyd Policing Act, are legislative initiatives in the Democratic Party that we had the opportunity in a tightly controlled United States Senate under the vote of Kamala Harris that we could have actually passed that legislation and had it signed into law by President Joe Biden. Joe Manchin joined the Republican Party in those efforts and stopped that legislation. And during that legislative session, he got so frustrated, he became an independent, oftentimes challenging the liberal, the left, and the black wing of the Democratic Party. Recently, as in with the last couple of hours, Joe Manchin has acknowledged that he will not run against Kamala Harris, and that I have heard that he is interested in becoming a Democrat again. Welcome home, Joe.
The Jackson family has endorsed Vice President Harris. Share with us how the Jackson family feels about Vice President Harris and what could it mean for the Black community?
Well, obviously, we support the progress of our people. We don't separate the Kamala Harris's unique position in American and in human history from the 19 scared Africans who escaped or who arrived on these shores in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. We understand where the Democratic Party came from when it was founded in 1793 by Thomas Jefferson, all the way to the party of Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. We beat the Confederates who ran the Democratic Party, which was founded as a states' rights and slave party in 1793 to protect local agrarian property interests, including slaves. We took over the Democratic Party. This is our ticket. It was our ticket in 2020 when Joe Biden promised to put Kamala Harris on the ticket and when he promised to appoint Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first African-American woman, to the Supreme Court. We saved Joe Biden's campaign. We saved his political neck in South Carolina. And South Carolina was moved up in the Democratic primary process because Jesse Jackson was from Greenville, South Carolina in 1984 and 88. And we had all of these little white states that you had to run through as a Democratic candidate. Before you get to South Carolina, you have no money left because you've been to Iowa, you've been to New Hampshire, you've been out west. By the time you finally get African-American voters to vote for you, you have no money left to communicate your message if you're going to be an effective candidate. Jesse Jackson changed those rules. And it is those rules, from 1793 to the present, in the Democratic Party that allowed Barack Obama to become the Democratic nominee, that allows Joe Biden to win the Democratic nomination in 2020. And it is the same rules, we call them Jesse's rules, that make it possible for Kamala Harris to come to Chicago and have smooth sailing.
The Democratic convention is coming up in the next couple of weeks. Matter of fact, in four weeks from now. Have your father been invited to come to the convention and say a couple of words?
I have no idea. I don't think my father's capable of saying a couple of words, but I do think there are some moments of recognition that may occur at the convention to honor his life and his legacy of service. And I expect my father to be there, probably in a booth, but I don't see him as audibly capable of speaking at the Democratic convention. But we're grateful for the party for that recognition, and I'm sure my family appreciates it.
Since President Biden announcement of stepping down from the Democratic ticket, the party, as you mentioned earlier, raised over $100 million and counting. And let's talk about the energy of the Democratic Party. Is it energized, in your
Oh,
opinion?
there is no doubt about it in ways that we could not have imagined with the selection of Kamala Harris. It's energized not only in fundraising, but it's energized at our base. Last night, there was a Zoom call with 40,000 women on it. Tonight, Roland Martin and Bakari Sellers and others are holding a Zoom call of African American men for Kamala Harris. When's the last time we held a Zoom call with 40,000 people on it or 50,000 people on it to address our interests? And so this level of enthusiasm matters. This is our country. This is our political party. We're not going anywhere, and we're making room for everyone to participate in this process. Kamala Harris is for America. She's for all of the people, and this is our time to shine.
Will you be on that call, sir?
I've been on calls in the past. It's been a real long couple of days for me. As you know, I've done my very best on social media to confront some of the challenges very publicly that Vice President Harris was confronting. We had a situation even after the announcement yesterday that the last people, imagine this, the last people to come on board were the Illinois Democrats. We hadn't heard from Durbin. We hadn't heard from Duckworth. We hadn't heard from Governor Pritzker. We did hear from the mayor of Chicago, who endorsed Kamala Harris. But I essentially said, listen, what kind of a host are we going to be for the Democratic convention if the Chicago Democrats can't make up their mind that Kamala Harris deserves their support? And so, like clockwork, all of these people have fallen in line now, and the path is clear for Kamala Harris not only to make history, but to change the course of human history with her nomination and her successful campaign for President of the United States against Donald Trump.
The most important question before the show, I received a phone call from an older woman who basically said, get in line. Can the Democrats, which I said earlier, can get in line? Can they be unified? Can they get their butts in gear? They don't want to hear no more about Joe Biden. They want to hear about people voting, convincing African American Black men to vote who is considering voting for Trump. And
that would be sad, and that would be shameful, given that so many of our interests are tied to the Democratic Party, and the demonstrated history of Donald Trump, his language, his vitriol, certainly works against our history. The end of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, the end of the Voting Rights Act, the end of Brown versus the Board of Education and Second Reconstruction. Sure, they say Kamala has done some things as Attorney General of the state of California that may be troubling for some Black men and for many Black men. But that is no basis to abandon the broad agenda that her candidacy represents for the masses of our people. And so I would encourage them, brothers, to stop complaining about what they don't have and use what they got. We ought not use this opportunity to vet all of the concerns we've had at the House and all the concerns we've had at home. This is the opportunity to do something for your mother. This is the opportunity to answer the prayers of your grandmother. This is the opportunity to do something for my daughter and your daughters. And they look up and watch Kamala Harris accept the nomination of the Democratic Party. And when they look up and see her sworn in as President of the United States, then we be winning. And let me give you this example. When my father was running for president, I believe in 1984, An older black woman was approached by some young black men who said, "Why are y'all voting for Jesse? Jesse can't win. Why are you voting for Jesse? Jesse can't win." And the old woman turned to those young black men and she said, "What do you mean we can't win? What do you mean he can't win? We be winning. We be winning every time we see him on TV debating those issues against all them boys on that stage with him. We be winning. We be winning every time Jesse make more sense than them white folks. We be winning. Every time he talks about health care for us and housing for us and ending discrimination against us, we be winning. We be winning every time historically black colleges and universities get funded under a Harris administration and not closed under a Trump administration. We be winning. What are you talking about? We be winning when we pass legislation to stop racial profiling. We be winning when we hold local police departments accountable and stop the militarization of the police. We be winning every time we can provide help for starving people in Africa and relieve some tensions at the border without the strategies of shipping people to Chicago and New York and dropping them off like they did us in the 60s when they would bus black people out of the South and drop them at the Kennedy's front door. And you can Google it. It was called the Reverse Freedom Rise. They were told in the South, if you go up and meet the Kennedys, they're waiting for you at their home and they'll give you a job. And poor black people would get off the bus, stand there, and the Kennedys are like, we didn't say that. We didn't invite y'all up here. That's exactly what they're doing with the immigrants. And we ought know better. We must turn to each other and not on each other, and we will be winning. That's what's at stake in 2024. And I would encourage my brothers to join the movement for change. History is unbroken continuity. Every vehicle that we're riding is not perfect. The Democratic Party is not perfect. The Republican Party is not perfect. We will have our disagreements. The masses of our people are coalescing around Kamala Harris, and it is a big open tent.
The Republican Party has announced some of their strategies to help get some of the black community vote. They're saying that Vice President Harris is a prosecutor. In the black community, social justice is a hot topic. How the Democratic Party can convince black men who say they were likely to vote for Trump not to vote for him and vote for Kamala Harris, who is a prosecutor, and the black community intends to frown upon because of her experience as a prosecutor, one mainly as she prosecuted, I believe, 200,000 blacks for marijuana.
So I'd like to see more leadership from the Democratic Party in this area. And we're going to make those demands of President Kamala Harris in ways that they won't be heard by President Donald Trump. There are 77 million men and women, black, white, striped, and polka dot, who've been through the criminal justice system, according to Kiplinger. Google Kiplinger, 77 million. 77 million men and women have paid their debt to society. And guess what? They've not been pardoned by the governor of California. Gavin Newsom has a lot of work to do for non-repeat offenders restoring their lives. 77 million. That means there are hundreds of thousands of people in Chicago and in the state of Illinois who've done what the state of Illinois asked them to do. They paid their debt to society. It's time for J.B. Pritzker to pull out the pardon pen. When Kamala Harris becomes president of the United States for federal offenses, it's time for her to pull out the pardon pen. And I'm not talking about highfalutin and high-name celebrities, one of which I may be one. I'm talking about for bus drivers who paid their debt to society 20 years ago and have never been pardoned. I'm talking about plumbers and average men and women who need their lives restored. So there are a lot that the Democratic Party can do on this question. That does not mean we abandon the best opportunity we have to have our phone call returned. Now, we're going to have access to Kamala Harris. We will not have access to Donald Trump. We will not have access to Supreme Court justices, 6 of whom are rolling back the clock on all of the progress we've made in the last century. and will have the opportunity to possibly appoint 2 or 3 more justices. Sotomayor is old and struggling with her health. Clarence Thomas is old and tired and should have been gone. And Justice Alito is old and tired and should be removed from the court for their ethics violations, if nothing else. That's 3 more Supreme Court justices. Now, he could have an entire packed court with only Ketanji Brown Jackson on the court and Elizabeth and Miss Kagan making sense. That would be nuts. And for us to only see Kamala Harris and not to understand the process by which federal judges are appointed, the process by which state judges are appointed, from governors and those, for example, in our county that are elected, we must engage that process and not abandon it.
In 1968, which you mentioned earlier, the Democratic Convention was in Chicago. A lot of protesters are expected in this go round in a couple of weeks, mainly because of immigration. Vice President Harris was in charge of the border. Does that spell weakness in her candidacy down the line because of immigration?
So there was this analogy that we used to talk about when we were when I was at the seminary, and there was this priest who was against almost every conceivable vice, right? And then the priest became cardinal. The cardinal died, and the Pope appointed him cardinal. And then as cardinal, he had a larger jurisdiction. In fact, he had a whole country under his jurisdiction. And in that country, there were blacks, there were whites, there were straights, there were gays, there were lesbians, there were men, there were women, there were old people, there were young people. And the cardinal's positions began to be softened because he was no longer a priest at a single church. He suddenly was the vicar of Christ over a country. And then the Pope died, and the cardinal went to Rome and was at the conclave. And at that point in the conclave, he became, he was elected Pope. And then as Pope, suddenly he wasn't a priest no more. He wasn't a cardinal no more. He was more like Pope Francis. Suddenly he was not condemning people and less judgmental and wanted to stop wars and engage in feeding the hungry and challenging the church to do more and stopping some of the behaviors of men in the ministry, trying his best to allow women to preach. Because when he was Pope, he saw more than when he was preacher, or priest. Just like Kamala Harris, who was a prosecutor, then she became a U.S. senator prosecuting people who might be on the Supreme Court and did a brilliant job of that. And then was learning the job of being vice president of the United States, which no one is born knowing how to do. It takes a minute to figure out what a vice president does, and we still don't know. And then suddenly you're the president of the United States. You have a $3.5 trillion budget. You have a global crisis in theaters around the world. You have threats to the United States of America from the transportation system, the commerce system, the aviation system. One bomb makes it across the border, and that's a different reality for the president of the United States than the attorney general of the state of Illinois. That's a different reality that person is briefed on every day, and they then have to grow out of being a local person to being a national person, to being a global person, to thinking more circumspectly about the decisions that they make, to really, really have some say in the life, liberty, and happiness of the American people, whether it is equality for women and women's rights to make decisions about their own bodies, or whether it is the civil rights of African Americans and immigrants and others who are no longer just blocking them at the border, but how do we handle people who are yearning to breathe free, who heard somewhere in their lives of a place where there was a city shining on a hill. And the only thing they ever learned about America when they made a 3,000-mile walk across multiple countries was this: give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses who yearn to breathe free. It's the only thing they know about America. And then they show up at the border only to confront tanks and police officers and cowboys with guns, and then say to themselves, what happened to the invitation? Now, we need an orderly process at the border. As President of the United States, I'm confident that President Kamala Harris will develop that worldview. And that worldview is not something that any of us have at the local police station when we see the immigrants dropped off from a bus that Abbott out of Texas and DeSantis out of Florida sent up to Chicago to disrupt the quality of our lives. We must be human and sensitive at the same time.
The problem is with that statement, sir, is Kamala Harris and Biden did produce a plan. The plan was rejected by the Republican Party, the immigration plan, because Donald Trump said, if you pass this plan, it will weaken me. We won't have nothing to talk about. They refused DACA early on. They rejected DACA. Kamala Harris in the forefront say we must renew DACA. They said no to that. So therefore, let's say hypothetically, you have a Kamala Harris as president, but you have a House Republicans, Senate Republicans. It's going to be so hard to pass anything. What would you say to that?
That'd be a difficult opportunity. That'd be a difficult challenge for the President of the United States. But let me offer another hypothetical if we go to work and we move beyond cynicism to hope. What if we have President Kamala Harris and Speaker of the House Hakeem Jeffries and President of the Senate Charles Schumer with sufficient margin to pass everything we want to pass? How about that hypothetical? Neither hypothetical are illegitimate potential considerations. One, overwhelmingly stacked towards Republicans if they regain control of the House or keep the House and regain control of the Senate. But what if we do our part? What if $100 million in one day raised by Kamala Harris means that we have the potential to really have a democratically controlled Congress with Hakeem Jeffries as the Speaker? What if $100 million by the end of next week means that we have a chance to regain and control the Senate with sufficient margins? What if Kamala Harris is president under that scenario? Between now and November, that's the scenario I'm going to keep dreaming about, and I'll let you know how I feel about that scenario the day after the election.
We're going to hold you to that, sir. Local news outlets reports that the Illinois leaders are divided. We spoke on this earlier over President Harris. It's not the type of numbers that you see right now. What are your hopes that the Illinois delegation, the Democratic delegation, get on board? Now, it wasn't like the North Carolina, South Carolina Democratic delegation saying all of our delegates are going to Kamala Harris. They did it overnight. They did it within hours.
Let me tell you how this works. It's okay for Democrats to be divided, and it's okay for some Democrats to be against Kamala Harris. I get it. But when we win, someone will have worked hard in those congressional districts for Harris. Someone will have worked hard across the state of Illinois. And those senators that opposed Kamala Harris will have their own challenges going forward. That's the way this actually works, the way it plays out. I remember when my father ran in 84 and 88, he had little support, if any, from the Congressional Black Caucus. By the time he ran in 84, little to no support. By the time he ran again in 88, because he was registering the most voters in their congressional districts, he had nearly unanimous support. By 1992, State Representative Cleo Fields was in the Congress of the United States. And Jim Clyburn was elected from South Carolina in a congressional district that was drawn in large measure because of what Jesse Jackson did in 1984-88. The district was drawn in 1990, and Jim Clyburn was elected in 1992. Maxine Waters was a commissioner. She became a congressman in a district that Jesse Jackson won for the first time in 84 and 88, and so on and so forth. I could go across the entire country and show you the members of Congress that were elected because of Jesse Jackson and those enthusiastic campaigns. This is what I think is going to happen. A new generation of people are going to emerge because Democrats are struggling with how to deal with Kamala. Well, you will know what to deal with Kamala when Generation Z and Generation X show up. And their leaders, for example, are two young men in Tennessee who stood up to the legislature to stop gun control and were kicked out of the legislature just like Julian Bond. They're fearless. They're determined. They're not sitting around stuck in some kind of paralysis of analysis, focusing on themselves and their own election chances. They're out here doing the work. They're pushing the system forward in spite of the cynicism, and they are driven by an energy and an eternal optimism that will be their victories in 2 to 4 years from now. I'm confident of it, and I can't wait to see it.
Do you think those people are on the wrong side of history?
Absolutely, they are. And if you want me to go from the history of from 1619 to the present, I'm more than capable. I look at history from 1619 to 1776 as the pre-construction phase of the nation's history. From the Declaration of Independence in 1776 to 1791, which includes the writing of the Constitution in 1787 as the construction phase of the nation. That lasted until 1860, 1861, the deconstruction phase of the United States, when the states decided to leave the Union rather than free the slaves. In 1865, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1867, the 15th Amendment in 1867 and 68, we went from states' rights to human rights, and that laid the foundation for first Reconstruction until Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. From 1896 to 1954, the era is known as Jim Crow. From 1954 to the present, Brown versus the Board of Education ended Jim Crow, and you and I were born in the period of the second Reconstruction of this nation. What's on the ballot in 2024? Whether or not we will enter into a second Jim Crow or a third Reconstruction under Kamala Harris. I see it as plain as the nose in the middle of my face. And that's why I'm putting all of my energy and all of my effort behind Kamala Harris, because we've got to put our finger in the dike of a huge problem that is coming our way. Even if immigrants don't see it, even if women don't see it, even if African Americans, some of them don't see it, we need to know that that is the pattern of history, and it has the potential to repeat itself in some form.
What are your thoughts on Pritzker running for president?
He today endorsed Kamala Harris, a wise move on Governor Pritzker's point of view and on his own political career and future. And I respect that. So my kudos to the governor. He was the last one of the potential candidates to endorse Kamala Harris. I was concerned about that, and legitimately so. Illinois is a blue state. It is solidly blue, from the city of Chicago to the bottom of the state. It is unlikely that the ticket will be chosen from someone from our state. Why? Because if we can't win Illinois, we can't get 270 electoral votes, given all the Democrats that we have in the state. We need somebody from Pennsylvania, a state we may lose, or Michigan, a state we may lose, someone from Georgia or North Carolina, a state we have the potential to win and or lose. The ticket has to be balanced between Kamala Harris and a state with appeal that probably doesn't represent all of our interests. Remember, Bill Clinton from Arkansas, Al Gore from Tennessee, John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts, Lyndon Johnson from Texas. Balancing the ticket. Dukakis from Massachusetts, Lloyd Bentsen from Texas. Balancing the ticket. Joe Biden from Delaware, Kamala Harris from California. Balancing the ticket. It is unlikely that Illinois will balance the ticket, because if we can't win Illinois and we have to spend a lot of resources in Illinois, we can't win nowhere. So we have to spend our time and our resources in states where we can register people to vote, inspire people to vote, move people from cynicism to optimism and hope, and encourage them to show up in great numbers in November.
Trump has called Vice President Harris, quote, a piece of work. How would Black organizations like Rainbow Push have Vice President Harris back from borderline racist remarks and misogynistic attacks from Trump and the Republican Party?
I can't speak for the Rainbow Push Coalition. I can't speak for the Urban League. I can't speak for the NAACP or any organization, nor do I claim to. But let me be crystal clear. Every Black man in this country ought to be outraged about the idea that Donald Trump insults us and insults our women to our face. Kamala Harris is not the only one he said negative and ugly things about. He said negative and ugly things about Omarosa. He called it nasty. He's going to say ugly things about your child, about your daughter. He's going to call her out of her name. And you ought to be outraged about it. Black men ought to stand up and be outraged about one person disrespecting our women. And that's good enough for me. I don't need an organization to say how outraged I am about it. It just makes me work a little harder, that's all.
What would you like to see Vice President Harris to choose as vice presidential candidate? My thoughts, in my opinion, is Wes Moore from Maryland. The governor of Maryland would be a great potential VP candidate.
I think Governor Wes Moore is a stellar future prospect of the Democratic Party. There's no doubt about it. Certainly, he should be vetted and considered. But the chances that an African American woman and an African American man are leading this party in this ticket, given the diversity of interests that the party represents, are close to zero. I mean, if Jesse Jackson were the Democratic nominee, there's no chance that he would pick someone other than someone of a different race, a different region, a different culture, a different class to broaden his base. Barack Obama had to pick what? Joe Biden to broaden his base. I fully expect Kamala Harris to not just operate from those of us who love her, who care for her, and appreciate this historic moment. I expect her to make a decision that does what? Broadens her base. If she makes a decision that does not broaden her base, I would be terribly disappointed as a political strategist. I would be deeply upset about that, quite frankly, because a huge opportunity would have been lost. We need someone, while she's debating Donald Trump, and just the imagery of what it looks like for her to debate Donald Trump, a Black woman challenging the misogynistic behavior of Donald Trump is in itself a prosecuting sexism and prosecuting racism, and the sensitivities that she will bring to his incoherent logic matters to us. It's worth seeing. Set your VCR, get your DVRs ready, because it's worth watching. I'd like to see it 3 times, to tell you the truth. But I'd also like to see possibly a Gretchen Whitmer debate J.D. Vance, who has some kind of Neanderthal positions on the role of women in the House. And they think that, like Mike Pence, who wife ought to stay home and ought not be out here doing things. Well, women have a place in the House of Representatives. They have a place in the vice president's mansion as vice president. And soon we will have a woman as president of the United States. That will be her house. And she will govern a nation, and she will do it with honor and integrity. I'd like to see that case pressed by a Kamala Harris with Donald Trump, a Gretchen Whitmer, a Governor Cooper, a Governor Shapiro, a Governor Beshear. I think they could bring a lot to this ticket and allow us access to people we normally would not have access to, and have access to the ballot boxes in rural counties, in suburban areas, in places we normally don't venture to. Because guess what, Roman? This is not a popularity contest. Kamala Harris could get 8 million more votes than Donald Trump, and she will not be president of the United States. United States, you need 270 electoral votes. And those electoral votes are distributed across all 50 states, which means we need an electoral vote strategy to win the presidency of the United States. And the names of the governors that I just mentioned are very important to that process.
I know you have served.
I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can barely hear you, but I'm going to try and talk as if I can.
Okay. My final question, and I'm going to wrap it up. My final question is: you served with Sheila, the late Sheila Lee. Can you tell us, because her recent passing over the weekend, can you tell us about her life briefly, and you working with her side by side?
Sheila Jackson Lee was the hardest working member of Congress I ever met during the course of my service in Congress. I remember the first time I ever met her on the floor of the Congress. She came and sat right next to me and she said, you know, you got this Jesse Jackson thing on you. I get it. She said, because I'm succeeding a pretty famous congresswoman out of Texas in Barbara Jordan as well. I've got to be seen up here as going to work. I remember it like I remember the scars on the back of my hand. It is crystal clear to me. Sheila Jackson Lee would open the Congress in the morning. She'd be the first one to speak. And after special orders, she would be the last person to speak. There isn't an amendment that she didn't offer. There isn't a debate that she didn't participate in. And it became so incredible that many of us would often say, Roman, oh, wow, here comes Sheila. What does she have to say? Many of us wouldn't have anything to say, but Sheila had a lot to say, and we are grateful for her life. Let me close on this point. Al Edwards passed legislation, the late Al Edwards, in the state of Texas to establish a statewide holiday called Juneteenth. Sheila Jackson Lee took that legislation from Al Edwards in the state of Texas, brought it to Washington, and had the Juneteenth holiday signed into law. And that's why we have a national holiday on Juneteenth. She's gone, but she will never be forgotten.
On that note, I thank you for joining the Drive at 5. Don't be a stranger. And also, please tell us where you can get your book.
My book is available on Amazon.com. The Finger of God is a 10-year project about a word construction that I found in the Constitution confirming that America is a theological experiment. I'm also the author of A More Perfect Union by Jesse Jackson Jr. It's also available on Amazon.com.
Thank you so much. Don't be a stranger to the Drive at 5. Thanks for joining us. That's going to do it for the Drive at 5 on IntellectualRadio.com. Thanks to Earl Winfrey, our executive producer. Wanda, who is behind the scenes. Stay tuned for more on IntellectualRadio.com. Have a good one.